The sun had barely started to dip below the horizon when he stepped outside, his loyal dog trailing behind him. The air was still warm from the afternoon heat, but the evening brought a kind of calmness that he cherished. Every day without fail he took his dog on a walk. It was their ritual, something that connected him to the present, a moment of peace amid the chaos of life. He didn't mind that people stared as he walked down the street. He didn't mind that some people seemed curious, even a little nervous. To him it was just another day. He was a man of few words, preferring to keep to himself. But there was an intensity about him that others couldn't quite place. A quiet presence that made people uneasy in ways they couldn't explain. It wasn't his height, though he stood taller than most. It wasn't his posture, though he carried himself with a confidence that most would admire. No, it was something deeper, something intangible. No one in the neighborhood knew what he had done in his past. They didn't know the strength of the man walking by, or the kind of life he had led before the quiet life he now lived. To them, he was just another face, another person with a dog. But if they had known the truth, they might have thought differently. Before all this, he had been someone entirely different, someone who had spent years in the service of his country, leading men through some of the most dangerous operations in the world. He had been at the helm of Delta Force, one of the deadliest special operations forces in existence. His name was spoken only in whispers among those who knew the kind of missions he had completed. Yet, for all his training and experience, he chose a life of anonymity. After leaving the military, he wanted nothing more than peace. In a way, walking his dog was his form of therapy. The streets, though mundane and sometimes loud with the chatter of the world, felt different when he was walking side by side with his dog. The rhythmic sound of their steps was grounding, a simple and calming rhythm that helped him keep his mind from wandering too far into the past. His dog, a large, loyal animal, kept close to him as they made their way down the familiar path through the neighborhood. The street was relatively quiet that evening. People were winding down from the workday, some returning to their homes, others out for an evening jog. There was a couple walking their own dog, a small crowd gathered in front of a local cafe, and a few kids playing in their front yards. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that would have indicated that this evening would soon take a turn for the worse. As they approached the park at the end of the block, the man's dog suddenly froze, its ears perked up. The man's attention immediately shifted to the dog, sensing something was off. His dog was normally calm, never quick to react to people or noise, so when it tensed like this, it was always a sign that something wasn't right. The man's hand instinctively went to the leash, pulling the dog back slightly. His senses were sharp, always had been, ever since his time in the field. He didn't know what it was, but something about the air felt wrong. He glanced around, but there was no immediate sign of danger. The park was as it usually was, quiet, almost empty at this hour. But there was a rustling sound nearby, and the man instinctively scanned the area for movement. His experience in high-stress situations told him to trust his instincts. In a matter of seconds, his mind had already processed the possibilities. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement near the edge of the park. A police car was slowly rolling down the street, its siren faintly audible in the distance. At first, he thought nothing of it. Police often patrolled the area, but then the car stopped abruptly, and the officers began to exit the vehicle. The dog's growls grew louder, its body tense as it stood at attention, its gaze locked on the approaching officers. The man immediately took a step back, sensing that things were about to escalate. His dog had been trained well, and it would only react like this if it felt threatened. He tried to calm the animal with a soft whisper, but the dog's instincts were strong, and the tension in the air had become palpable. The officers, seemingly unaware of the man's presence or his dog's behavior, began to approach. There were two of them, one tall and stocky, the other shorter but equally determined. They seemed focused, their eyes darting around as they made their way toward the park. The taller officer spoke in a low voice, the words muffled by the distance. The man stood still, watching them. His mind raced, calculating the best way to de-escalate the situation. In his experience, the wrong move could lead to disaster. He wasn't just any person walking his dog. He knew that the officers didn't know who he was, but he was also aware that they weren't used to dealing with the kind of threat that he could pose if things went sideways. But he didn't want that to happen. He didn't want to bring violence into this quiet evening. He just wanted peace. But the officers were getting closer now. His dog's growls intensified, and the man instinctively tightened his grip on the leash, trying to steady the animal. But before he could react, the officer closest to the dog made a sudden move, shouting something the man couldn't quite catch. The dog, already on edge, saw this as an immediate threat. In one swift motion, it lunged toward the officer. It all happened so fast. The officer, caught off guard, instinctively reached for his weapon. The man tried to call out to get the officer's attention, but it was too late. In the blink of an eye, the gunfire rang out and the dog fell to the ground, the life drained from it in an instant. The man's heart stopped. He rushed forward, his mind a blur of confusion and disbelief. "No," he shouted, kneeling beside his fallen companion, his hands trembling as he reached for the dog's body. The world seemed to slow down around him. His heart pounded in his chest as he cradled the dog, trying desperately to wake it, but the damage was done. The dog was gone. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The officers stood frozen, their hands still hovering over their weapons. The man's chest tightened, his anger growing, but he knew that acting in haste would only make things worse. He took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to handle the situation. The officers stood back, unsure of what to do. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him either. To them, he was just another man with a dog. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know the kind of man they were dealing with. As the man looked up at the officers, his face calm but his eyes hard, he knew that this was only the beginning. They had no idea who he really was, and soon they would find out. The man sat motionless, his hand still gently resting on his dog's lifeless body. The shock of the moment had yet to fully wear off. He could still hear the gunshot ringing in his ears, echoing through his mind, as if the world was slowing down around him. The heat from the day seemed to rise up again, making him feel like he was trapped in a pressure cooker, the air thick and suffocating. His heart raced and his mind was filled with a single burning thought: how could this have happened? He had seen his share of violence in the past, had faced threats that would make most people freeze with fear. He had faced down enemies that would never hesitate to pull a trigger. But this was different. This wasn't a mission. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his dog. His friend, his companion, and it had been taken away in an instant by a mistake that never should have happened. He looked up at the two officers, still standing a few feet away, their faces a mix of confusion and guilt. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea of the kind of man standing before them, the kind of life he had lived. To them, he was just another black man in the neighborhood, another person to be wary of. To them, he was just another person whose dog had attacked them. But that couldn't have been further from the truth. The taller officer stepped forward, his face pale and his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the moment. I didn't mean to," he stammered. The man stood slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling on the ground. His mind was still clouded with rage, but he knew better than to let it take over. He had been trained to stay calm, to think clearly in the heat of battle. He wasn't going to let his emotions control him now. "Why did you shoot?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp, like the edge of a blade. The officers looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. They had been trained to respond to threats, to neutralize danger. But in their rush to act, they hadn't thought through the consequences. They hadn't considered the possibility that they might be making a mistake. We thought your dog was going to attack," the shorter officer said, his voice lacking confidence. It lunged at us. We had to protect ourselves." The man's chest tightened at the officer's words. His dog had never attacked anyone. It had been trained well, and though it was protective, it had never shown signs of aggression toward people. The officer's fear had clouded his judgment, and now there was no undoing what had been done. "I told you to stop," the man said, his voice steady but with a hardness that made the officers flinch. "I told you my dog wouldn't hurt you. But you didn't listen. You just reacted." The taller officer looked away, his face flushed with shame. The man could see it in his eyes. The guilt, the recognition that something had gone terribly wrong. But guilt didn't bring back a life. Guilt didn't undo the damage that had been done. And as much as the man wanted to scream, to demand answers, he knew that doing so wouldn't fix anything either. His thoughts turned to his dog. He could feel the emptiness inside, the weight of the loss pressing down on him. The dog had been with him through thick and thin, through the darkest moments of his life. His dog had been there when he had returned from missions, when the nightmares of war still haunted him. It had been the one constant, the one thing that kept him grounded in a world that often felt chaotic and uncertain. And now, that was gone. But he knew he couldn't let his grief consume him. He had to stay focused. There were things that needed to be done, things that couldn't wait. He looked back at the officers, his eyes hard and cold. "I want your badge numbers," he said, his voice unwavering. "And I want this reported." The officers exchanged another glance. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to handle this man, this quiet, composed figure standing before them, who seemed to be holding back a storm of fury. They didn't know that they had just made a mistake that would come back to haunt them in ways they couldn't imagine. The man knew the system. He had been in situations before where the rules didn't apply, where the truth was buried under layers of bureaucracy and corruption. But he also knew that sometimes, just sometimes, the system could work. If he pushed hard enough, if he fought for what was right, justice could be served. The taller officer hesitated, but then gave the man his badge number. The shorter officer followed suit. The man took note of them, his mind already calculating what steps to take next. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. He glanced down at the dog once more, feeling the sharp pain of the loss. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not yet, there was work to do. He stood up fully, his back straight, his posture firm, as if he had never been shaken by the events that had just unfolded. "Get the animal control officer here," he said to the officers, his voice low but commanding. "I want the proper paperwork filed, and I want a full report. You will not sweep this under the rug." The officers nodded quickly, both of them clearly eager to get away from the situation, not knowing what to say, not knowing what to do. But the man wasn't going to let them off that easily. They had caused irreparable harm, and they needed to be held accountable. As the officers moved away, the man took one last look at the dog. He felt a pang in his chest, a raw, gnawing pain that reminded him of all the years he had spent in the field, all the things he had seen and done. His life had never been easy, and though he had chosen peace in his post-military years, he knew there would always be battles to fight. Some of them would be fought with weapons, others with words. This was one of those times when words were his weapon. The pain of the loss was still there, but now it was tempered by something else, a resolve, a fire that burned deep inside him. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let them think they could get away with it. As he walked toward his home, the weight of the evening pressed on him. He could hear the sounds of the neighborhood again, the laughter of children, the soft murmur of voices. It was all so normal, so peaceful. But nothing felt normal now. Not anymore. This had been a turning point, a moment when the quiet life he had built was shattered. But it wasn't just about the dog. It was about something bigger, something that had been brewing for a long time, something that he could no longer ignore. The truth was, the man had never wanted to be seen. He had never wanted to be known. But now it seemed like the world was going to learn who he really was, whether he liked it or not. The man spent the next few hours in a haze. The pain of losing his dog still gnawed at him, but he knew there was little time for grief. He had been in situations before where everything felt lost, where everything seemed to spiral out of control, but he had always been able to regain his focus, to find his way through the storm. This time would be no different. As he sat at his kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee forgotten beside him, he sifted through the thoughts in his mind. He had been through countless missions, each one filled with its own set of challenges and risks, but nothing had prepared him for this. The dog had been his companion, his source of comfort, the one living being that had never judged him. The betrayal of what had happened stung in ways that felt deeper than any wound he had ever received. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let his emotions control him. There was a right way to handle this, and he would make sure that justice would be done. His hand instinctively reached for his phone, and he dialed the number he had written down earlier, the officer's badge number. He needed to find out more, to get the full story and figure out the best way to move forward. The phone rang once, then twice, before a voice answered. It was the officer, the same one who had fired the shot. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was tentative, unsure. The man's grip on the phone tightened. He had been trained to deal with high-stress situations, but this was different. This was personal. "You shot my dog," the man said, his voice low but firm. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The officer must have been trying to process what the man had just said. After a few seconds, he spoke again, his voice softer. I know, I'm really sorry about that. I didn't mean for it to happen. The man could hear the regret in the officer's voice, but it didn't make the pain go away. His dog was still gone, and no amount of apology could bring it back. Sorry doesn't bring back my dog, the man said, his voice calm but with an edge. I want a full report. I want to know exactly what happened, how this could have been avoided. The officer sighed heavily. We thought the dog was a threat. It lunged at us, and we acted on instinct. I should have done more to assess the situation before pulling the trigger. I just panicked. The man's mind raced. The officer's panic had cost him dearly. But it also spoke to something bigger, a lack of training, a lack of awareness when it came to how to handle situations with people who had military experience or, in this case, military dogs. The police had been trained to respond quickly, but that quickness had caused irreparable harm. I want this on record, the man said, his voice steady. I'll be filing a complaint and I'll be pursuing legal action. The officer stammered on the other end of the line, clearly uncomfortable. I understand. I know we've made a huge mistake, but please don't make this worse than it already is. The man paused, taking in the officer's words. He wasn't sure if the officer was truly remorseful or just scared. Regardless, he couldn't let this go. His dog wasn't just a pet. It was a companion who had seen him through the darkest times of his life. The man's past wasn't something he often shared with others, but it shaped everything he did. He had led soldiers in places most people couldn't even imagine, and he had returned from missions that had left him with scars, both physical and emotional. His dog had been a part of his healing process, something constant in a world that often felt unpredictable and chaotic. I'll be in touch, he said, ending the call. He didn't need to say anything more. The officer knew what was at stake now. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of what he had just committed to settling on him. The legal battle would take time. It would be a process full of red tape, paperwork, and endless meetings. But it had to be done. He had to make sure something like this didn't happen again, not just for him, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. For the rest of the evening, the man went through the motions. He made a few more calls, getting in touch with legal advisors, animal rights groups, and anyone who might help him with his case. The more he talked to people, the more he realized that the issue went far beyond his dog. It wasn't just about the dog's death. It was about the lack of understanding, the lack of training when it came to dealing with people who had military backgrounds or military animals. There was a gap, a deep, fundamental misunderstanding, and it needed to be addressed. The next day, he made his way to the police station to file the formal complaint. He had been through enough legal battles in his life to know how to navigate the system, how to present his case in a way that would leave no room for doubt. But even as he stood in the lobby, filling out the paperwork, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling in a way he couldn't entirely control. The officers who had shot his dog hadn't known who he was, and in a way that was both the problem and the solution. If they had known, if they had understood the kind of person they were dealing with, maybe things would have turned out differently. But it was too late for what-ifs. Now, he had to fight for justice, not just for his dog, but for the people who would come after him. Weeks passed, but the case never left his mind. He spent his days trying to keep his routine as normal as possible, trying to stay busy with other tasks, but the weight of the situation hung over him. He knew that it wasn't just about a dog anymore. It was about confronting the broken system that allowed these kinds of mistakes to happen. It was about making sure the officers who had acted out of fear and ignorance were held accountable. Every conversation with his lawyer, every email, every phone call only strengthened his resolve. The more he learned about police procedures, the more he realized just how much needed to change. The problem wasn't just about a lack of understanding about military-trained dogs. It was about the systemic issues that led to an overreaction when things went wrong. The culture needed to shift. The training needed to change. But there were other things that weighed heavily on him, things from his past, things he had locked away. In the quiet moments, he allowed himself to remember what he had seen and done in the military. He remembered the brotherhood, the loyalty, the bond between men who had been through unimaginable horrors together, and he remembered the sacrifices, the things they had all given up. In a way, the dog had been his anchor to that world. And now, with the dog gone, it felt like he was losing that piece of himself. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he walked back home, the night air cool against his skin. As he reached the door of his house, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The house was quiet. His dog wasn't there to greet him. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the loss. But as he stepped inside, he also knew that this wasn't over. The fight for justice had only just begun. Days turned into weeks, and the process of seeking justice became more taxing than the man had anticipated. Filing the complaint had only been the beginning. The system, as he had feared, moved slowly. Legal battles were never quick, and every day felt like another step toward an unknown conclusion. But he had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this slide. The loss of his dog, the loss of his companion, wasn't something he could simply forget. This wasn't just about getting justice for himself, but about making sure this never happened again to anyone else. He spent his time researching, gathering information, and meeting with lawyers who specialized in police misconduct. The more he learned, the more frustrated he became. There were so many systemic issues that needed addressing, issues that went beyond his dog's death. It wasn't just about an overreaction in the moment. It was about the culture of fear and the lack of proper training when it came to military animals and veterans. Too many people were being misjudged. Too many were being treated with suspicion based on nothing but their appearance or past experiences. And the consequences were often severe. In a way, the man's decision to pursue legal action had become more than just a battle for his dog. It had become a stand against a system that he knew could be better, but only if enough people were willing to fight for change. He had heard from a few of his old military contacts. They were supportive, offering help if he needed it, but he didn't want to involve anyone from his past just yet. He knew that the legal process would be long and messy, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. There was no going back now. One morning he woke up early as he always did. The sky was still dark, the air crisp with the promise of a new day. He felt a familiar tug of sadness as he went to prepare his morning coffee. The silence of the house was deafening without his dog, and even though it had only been a few weeks, it felt like a lifetime. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee slowly, trying to center himself. His thoughts wandered back to the moment it all happened. The officer's face as he pulled the trigger, the confusion in the air as the dog fell to the ground. He had seen death before, but this wasn't the same. This wasn't the battlefield. This wasn't a mission gone wrong. This was personal. The man shook his head, clearing his thoughts. He couldn't dwell on it. Not now, he needed to focus. There were meetings to attend, calls to make. He was on a path now, and he couldn't afford to slow down. He stood up and walked to his front door, opening it to step outside. The neighborhood was waking up, the sounds of cars starting, distant voices murmuring as people began their day. It was also ordinary. Everything felt ordinary, and yet nothing was the same anymore. He walked toward the mailbox and found a letter from the police department addressed to him. It was an official letter, something that usually meant bad news. He hesitated for a moment before tearing it open. Inside, it was a formal acknowledgement of his complaint. The department was taking the matter seriously, but it also stated that an internal review would take time. The usual bureaucratic response, but at least it was a start. He read the letter twice, his mind processing the words carefully. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't going to be easy. There would be pushback. The department would fight to protect its officers as they always did. But the man wasn't intimidated. He had faced much worse in his life. This would be a test of his patience and his resolve, but he was determined to see it through. Later that day, he received a call from his lawyer. The conversation was straightforward. There had been some developments in the case. The police had agreed to meet with him and discuss the incident. The man knew this meeting was important. It could either be a step forward or a waste of time, but he wasn't about to back down. He had made up his mind, and nothing would change that. He prepared himself for the meeting. He gathered the documents, the records, the evidence that would support his case. He didn't expect an apology from the officers. He didn't expect them to admit fault right away, but he wanted them to understand the weight of their actions, to understand that this wasn't just about a dog. It was about respect. It was about understanding. It was about treating people with dignity, regardless of their past, regardless of their appearance. When the day of the meeting arrived, he dressed simply, not wanting to make a scene. He didn't need to show off his past. He didn't need to remind anyone of what he had done before. The truth was he had spent most of his life in the shadows, never looking for recognition or praise. But now, he was fighting for something more than himself. The police station was busy when he arrived. Officers came and went, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. The man was led into a small conference room, where two of the officers involved in the shooting were already waiting. They looked uncomfortable, as if they knew what was coming. He could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't a simple conversation. This was a reckoning. The man sat down at the table across from them, his posture straight and his expression calm. He didn't need to speak yet. He could feel the weight of the situation, the significance of this moment. The officers shifted in their seats, waiting for him to speak first. Finally, one of them broke the silence. "We've reviewed the incident," the officer said, his voice tight. "We understand it was a mistake and we're sorry for what happened." The man's eyes didn't leave him. He wasn't interested in an apology. He wanted more than that. "Sorry doesn't bring my dog back," he replied, his voice steady. "Sorry doesn't fix what happened that day. I'm here to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. This isn't just about me. It's about the next person whose dog you might shoot out of fear or misunderstanding." The officer's face tightened, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he looked at his partner, who nodded slightly. The man could see the unease in their expressions. They hadn't expected this kind of confrontation. They had expected anger, maybe violence, but not this calm, measured response. "I'm not here to make this worse," the man continued, his voice unwavering. "But I want you to understand that this is bigger than a simple mistake. It's about how you see people, it's about how you see animals, and it's about how you react when you feel threatened." The officers didn't respond immediately. The room was filled with the heavy silence of two people realizing they were in a situation they didn't fully understand. The man wasn't just talking about the incident. He was talking about something deeper, something that needed to change. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving theirs. "You need better training. You need to understand that people, especially those with military experience, are not the enemy. They are not the threat. And when you make mistakes like this, you hurt more than just one person. You hurt an entire community." There was another long pause, and for a moment it seemed like the officers didn't know how to respond. Finally, the shorter officer spoke, his voice softer this time. "We'll take your concerns into consideration," he said. "We're committed to improving our training and making sure something like this doesn't happen again." The man nodded slowly, knowing it wasn't enough, but it was a start. He stood up, ready to leave. "I expect to hear from you soon. I'll be watching." As he walked out of the room, he didn't feel like he had won, but he didn't feel defeated either. This was only one battle in a much larger war. The real fight had only just begun. The days following the meeting felt surreal. The man had expected a quick resolution, but instead he found himself waiting. The hours stretched long, each moment filled with anticipation. He wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed sitting still. He was used to action, to decisiveness, to the kind of certainty that came with training and experience. But this was different. This wasn't a mission with clear objectives. This was personal. Each day he checked his phone, waiting for updates. He went about his routine, doing the necessary chores around the house, keeping his body in shape with regular exercise, and trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. But the nagging emptiness from the loss of his dog never fully left him. The house felt too quiet without the familiar patter of paws on the floor, without the comforting presence of his faithful companion by his side. Though the dog was gone, its memory lingered. It wasn't just the dog's loyalty or its companionship that the man missed. It was the sense of calm the animal had brought him, the reminder that even in a world full of uncertainty, there were things worth holding on to. The man knew that his life would never be the same again. The absence of his dog was a constant reminder that sometimes, even the smallest moments of peace could be shattered in an instant. Then, one morning, he received the call. It was from his lawyer. His heart skipped a beat as he picked up the phone. "We've made some progress," the lawyer's voice said, steady and professional. "The police department has agreed to settle." The man stood still, the weight of the words slowly sinking in. The police department was offering a settlement. It wasn't the kind of victory he had imagined when he first set out on this journey, but it was something. And in the end, it was more than he had hoped for. He sat down, his hands gripping the phone tightly. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "They've agreed to provide compensation for the loss of your dog, and they've also committed to reviewing their training procedures," the lawyer explained. "It's not an admission of guilt, but it's a step in the right direction." The man absorbed the information. Compensation wasn't what he had wanted. Money couldn't bring back his dog. But the promise to review their training procedures, now that was something. It meant that potentially, fewer dogs and fewer people would be hurt by the same mistake in the future. It meant that somehow the world might be a little bit safer. And for the man, that was enough. "I'll accept the settlement," the man said quietly, his voice firm. "But I want to make sure they follow through on the training changes. I want to make sure this isn't just another empty promise." The lawyer assured him that the department would be held accountable. "We'll make sure they follow through. This is a start, and it's something we can build on." After the call ended, the man sat in silence for a long while. It was over, at least in some sense. The battle had been long and exhausting, but in the end it had yielded results. He knew the fight wasn't truly over. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to address. But this one had been significant. It had given him a sense of closure, a feeling that he had done everything he could to make things right. Over the next few weeks, the police department followed through on their commitment. They publicly announced new policies regarding how officers should handle encounters with military veterans and their animals. There was talk of additional training for officers, a focus on reducing fear-driven responses, and an emphasis on understanding and de-escalation techniques. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and for the man that was enough. As the months passed, he found himself slowly adjusting to life without his dog. The emptiness didn't go away, but he learned to carry it, to live with it. He knew he would never forget the bond he had shared with his dog. That bond was unbreakable even by death, but the fight for justice had given him something else, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be a path forward. One evening, as he walked through the neighborhood again, he felt a strange sense of peace. The streets were quiet, the evening air cool against his skin. He paused at the park where everything had started, the place where his life had been irrevocably changed. The park was empty now, the sound of children's laughter replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the world wash over him. He thought about his dog, about the times they had spent together, and about the future. There was still much to do, still much to learn. The world wasn't perfect, and the fight for justice never truly ended. But he had learned something important in the past few months. Sometimes the hardest battles were fought in silence, and sometimes it wasn't about winning or losing, it was about doing what was right. As he turned to head home, he felt a sense of resolution. His dog was gone, but its memory would always live on in him. And in some small way, he had made the world a little bit better. He had made a difference not just for himself, but for everyone who might face a similar injustice. The fight had been hard, but it had been worth it.